Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are sitting down with our resident historian at the Wonder Project, the one and the only John Dominic Crossan. And so Dom, welcome back to the podcast. I think this is your third, maybe a fourth time here, but it's always good to see you.
Good to be back, Glenn. One of these times I must be going to get it right. I keep coming back. So
That's it. We keep giving you another chance, Dom.
right. Fourth time is lucky.
That's right. So you have a new book out. It's called Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization. And here's the deal. I think I mentioned it to you in email just a little bit briefly before we hit record. But I need you to help solve my Paul dilemma today, because what I mean by that is I really enjoyed your book. I'm like 3/4 of the way through. But I will admit that I had a hard time getting into it. And it has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with the writing, your work. I love everything you do, but it has everything to do with the Apostle Paul and the, I feel like, love-hate relationship I have with him, because I, like a lot of our listeners, grew up in a very fundamentalist world where Paul was king. He's the king of rules, doctrines, and things that you need to believe and line up in order to really be considered a Christian. And more often than not, his words were often weaponized against me to keep me from going astray. Or I was also taught how to weaponize his words against other people as well. And so now that I've, deconstructed them, neck deep in deconstruction and rethinking a lot of the things that I grew up with, I really struggle at this point in my faith with Paul and what to do with him. And so what I want to do today is I want to give you the floor, and I'd love if you could maybe begin by maybe sharing with us, obviously, a little bit about the book, but the relationship with Paul that you've had over the years and how it's evolved, how it's grown, and how it's come to this, evolutionary matrix that you describe in the book, and what that has to do with me and you and our listeners. So wherever you want to begin, Dom, take us into it. Help me take it apart.
I'll have to ask your audience to be patient with my backstory, because you have a backstory you just given. I have one too.
Good.
Basically, in the year 2000, Marcus and Marianne Borg asked Sarah and myself, would you like to start coming with us? They had been going to Israel for the historical Jesus. Would you like to start coming to us every year? We take about 40 people around Turkey in the footsteps of Paul. Now, honestly, my first reaction was, am I really interested in Paul at all? I was interested in the historical Jesus, yes. I'm interested in Paul insofar as he reflects the historical Jesus, rightly or wrongly. But I said, well, that means we get to go all over Turkey free? And they said, yep. And I said,
somebody's got to do it, Dom.
It's like a plan, So we started. Now, here's what happened, honestly. I had heard of Paul primarily in the disputes of the Reformation, okay? He was weaponized as the Jew who left Judaism and became a Christian. And that was kind of like the monk Luther who left Catholicism and became, let's say, a Lutheran. And so all of that I thought was absolute bunk, to be honest with you. Now, what happened was, watching Paul and watching people watch Paul in the ruins of the Roman Empire every year between 2000 and 2014, and going back year after year and watching people respond. Mostly the people who came with us said, well, we're kind of interested in Paul. We wouldn't be paying so much to come on this trip. But, we're giving you guys, Marcus and I, a last redeeming chance. Can you make this guy tolerable? I'm not even going to say enjoyable, tolerable. So people started off honestly like that. We're here because of you guys. We're not certain about this guy, Paul. If you guys can't make sense of Paul, half the New Testament, then we give up. So that was the atmosphere. Now, we watched what happened to people as they read Paul, thought about Paul, discussed Paul. Marcus and I give lectures every night, half an hour apiece, in the ruins of the Roman Empire. That's where we were. You were to say Aphrodisias or Ephesus or Priene or Tarsus or wherever. But we had managed not to read them in terms of vicarious atonement and all the other stuff they hated, because we were locating him. We spent the day, as it were, on site, Antioch, say, on the Orontes. You spend the day there. Then at night we give lectures, and we correlate Paul with the site. We're not correlating Galatians so much with Acts as Galatians with Pisidian Antioch, where we had spent the day. We'd walked up to the height of the city, and we looked at the great shrine to Caesar Augustus, who was Lord and King and God and God incarnate and Redeemer from sin and the creator of the new world and what did I miss? Son of God. And that evening, we had to talk about those same titles used for Jesus. And the question became nothing to do with the Reformation, but what did it mean that the titles of Caesar, the Roman emperor on the Palatine Hill, were, what verb do I say, taken from him and given to this Jewish peasant from the Nazareth region, Galilee? What did it mean? Now, bracket whether you like it or not, bracket whether you think you should do this or that. Caesar or Christ became the powerful ruins of the Roman Empire. And it's after 2001. We were supposed to go there, by the way, in September the 19th. We were supposed to fly to Turkey, Istanbul, on September the 19th, 2001. Obviously, we didn't go. Now, you're talking to people about the ruins of an empire, to put it that way, even the ruins of civilization, because Rome was civilization, first century in a toga. Now, what does Paul have to say then that might be very, very, very relevant right now? We watched it happen. Marcus one time said to me, Glenn, are we getting much better at this? And I said, no, we both agreed. No, we're not getting better. The reception is changing. And we watched it happen. Now, all of that other stuff is there. And you have to kind of clean up Paul. And the only way to clean him up is not by fighting against this and fighting against that and fighting, but to give a completely first century interpretation of Paul as relevant for the 21st century. If you can't do that, then Paul, let him stay in his grave. And I do, by the way, I do admit completely there's great difficulties with Paul because we only have letters. And you're reading somebody else's mail. And if you say, I don't have a clue what he's talking about, okay, that's what happens when you read somebody else's mail. The recipients understand him, Paul understands him. So yeah, the problems we all have with Paul, that's how they were saved for me. And of course, the books I've written about Paul since reflect all of that experience.
So what are some ways then, like you talk about first century Paul, modern day Paul, what are some of the, like, for our listeners, what are some of the differences there? Because like for me, again, growing up in the world I was in, especially even like in seminary, like, you read Paul, you read books about Paul, and it's like, this is who Paul was. This is who Paul has always been. But now I'm at this place where I'm realizing, like you just said, like, putting yourself back in the context of these letters that were written, and we just have, it's just a small sampling of all the things that Paul probably said. We have this very, very small sampling, and each one of these samples was spoken to specific groups of people going through these specific things. So like if we strip it all away, like what are some of the differences in your mind between first century Paul and Paul as we often talk about him today?
All right. Very often what I get even from my colleagues never talks about what Jesus did during his life. There's nothing about what Jesus, the healings, the sayings, the parables. Where is all of that? He just wants to talk about the death and resurrection, the death and resurrection. And immediately,
one-track mind.
One-track mind. Immediately, of course, what comes roaring in then is vicarious atonement. That's what he's talking about. So I would have to ask people, for the moment, let us focus on the fact that, yes, correctly. He has almost nothing to say. He may touch on it a bit in Romans, the end of 12 on Jesus. But basically, I think Paul's a little bit diffident about the fact that he wasn't there.
Mm.
And that statement of his that, well, if we knew Jesus according to the flesh, we don't know him that anymore. Yeah, if I was in his position arguing with Peter, who had tramped the lanes of Galilee with Jesus all the time, I might feel a little bit, well, yeah, I wasn't there. It was like, you know all about Martin Luther King, but you didn't march beside him. Okay, now you can talk, but the people who marched
Know your
beside,
place.
yeah, you recognize your place.
Yeah.
You're late. So, but now let me focus for a moment on the two things for which Paul will live and die. You got it in 1 Corinthians, the first 3 chapters and the 15th.
Mhm.
Let me try and clear our minds completely of anything we know about Paul. What I get from that, and this for me is the beating heart of Paul. Paul is, now I'm not certain of the verb. I'm going to say amazed, enthralled, thunderstruck, any verb you want. By, from his point of view, from all eternity, God, now this is Paul's God, from all eternity, God knew that when the Messiah came, let's say when Messiahship became incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, the greatest empire the world had ever known, that boasted of its law and its order and its peace and its civilization, executed him legally, officially, publicly. He wasn't lynched.
Mm.
Now, here's what amazes Paul. It's not what amazes us. What amazes Paul is, what was God up to?
Mm.
Not just, oh, that's bad. Rome is bad. No. Pilate having a bad hair day. No. What on earth could God have allowed that to happen, or decreed it to happen, or decided? You choose your verb. And his own revelation, and it is an apocalypse, as you would call it, in the first chapters of Corinthians, is, I got it. The reason God, let me say, allowed the Messiah to be executed by Roman civilization is to reveal to us, the human race, the savage heart of civilization.
Mm.
Here's where I see it. The phrase he says, none of the rulers, the archontes, none of the rulers of this world understood this, because if they did, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory, which revealed, I'm now commenting on Paul, which revealed the vacuity, the hypocrisy, the nonentity of human civilization. Now, that's his huge revelation. That's what the execution means for Paul. It's got nothing to do with vicarious atonement. It really doesn't. It's just not there. But there is something else. So execution, and I'm deliberately using the word execution, not just crucifixion, which we've kind of,
Carries a lot of baggage.
got used to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Execution, executed legally,
Mhm.
all the terms I'm saying. As I say, it wasn't that Pilate just was mad at it. He picked up 10 Jews and killed 10 Jews. No, it was a very, Pilate made a decision that this guy proposes our law and order. He's not violent. If he was violent, I'd round up all his followers I could get my hands on. There'd be 12 crosses up there. I recognize he's the leader of a non-violent but subversive group. And what we do in Rome is we pick off the leader then. The hoi polloi will disappear. So the second thing, equally important for Paul, I think of it as the other side of a single coin for Paul. So if execution reveals the brutality of civilization, then resurrection reveals the cosmic justice of God. So you cannot separate them from Paul. If you if you go into a church and what you see there is a cross, and you somehow don't see the resurrection, Paul would say, ay, 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 ay. That's a one-sided coin, and you can't have a one-sided coin. So he can at any moment, of course, emphasize one or the other, depending upon who's he's talking to. But you can always look at a coin, as I said, and see one or the other, but you know the other's there. So if you want to start with Paul, I think that's the best place, because he says, and we come back to this, that the resurrection has already started with Jesus. That's at 1 Corinthians 15, as everyone knows. It's the first fruits of the resurrection, the beginning of the resurrection. So to understand Paul, you're talking now about, as early as the 30s. Let's say if Jesus is dead in the year 30, quite likely, Paul is already at Damascus, persecuting followers of Jesus by 33. Can you imagine what that tells us about how many followers Jesus must have had? They're in Damascus. I would not have dreamt that if I didn't know about Paul, and you said to me, how far were they spread? I would say, well, maybe they'd inched into Samaria, or maybe, Galilee, obviously, but they were in Damascus, and big enough that somebody has to persecute them. So I would presume that tells us a lot about the historical Jesus and his success. So that's how Paul is always part of Jesus for me, if apart from him always talking about Jesus.
Yeah. So let's talk about let's go into that a little bit, because you talked about the execution and the resurrection and like the two-sided coin. In your estimation, like thinking about Paul, let me back up for a second. So like for me, in my past, I would have said the resurrection, was a literal event. Like this really happened, exactly as it says it happened in the Gospels, all these different things. Nowadays, I've flipped a little bit and I see it more metaphorically. And I think a lot of the stories of Jesus, walking on the water, different things like that, more metaphorical in nature, these stories that were told and crafted in specific ways to make very specific and strong points. So I'm curious, like, what do you think Paul thought about these things regarding Jesus, in particular the resurrection? Because I've heard some people say that, Paul must have believed in this literal resurrection, as like all over the scriptures, all over his writings. He must have believed in the miracles of Jesus, even though he didn't really talk about them. He must have believed all these different things. But if you go back, like now, if I go back and I read the letters of Paul, in the past, I would have said, yes, he absolutely believed everything was literal, just as he says. But now, if I go back and read it through my own metaphorical glasses, I sometimes can help but wonder, did Paul maybe see these things more metaphorically as well? And did we take some of his metaphorical language, even if it wasn't all metaphorical, did we take at least some of the metaphorical language and insist it and put it into our literal boxes in order to make it more literal language? Like, what is your thought about that? Did Paul see any of this metaphorically, or was it all literal?
Let me come back to that term metaphor later. Bring me back to it if I forget about
Sure.
it. Here's my way of cutting through the debate.
Mm-hmm.
If you know, and you should know, I don't mean you, but if we know, and we should know, Roman imperial theology, which existed before Paul or Jesus ever appeared on the scene,
Mm-hmm.
I would put it this way. Let me rephrase the question. Did Caesar Augustus and the Roman Empire take all this stuff about him being divine, Son of God, Lord, Savior of the world, Redeemer from sin, creator of the new world, the whole bunch?
Mm-hmm.
Did they take it literally or metaphorically? Now, if you say literally, and I don't know any classical scholar who does, but let you say literally, then fair enough. I will take it all literally of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Now my problem is it's literally of two guys. I can't use C.S. Lewis's slick way out of saying, well, either Jesus is nuts or he's true. Wait a minute. There's two nuts in the first century. There's the Caesar nut and the Christ nut.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't avoid faith. because it's a contest. So now, if you take all the Caesar stuff literally, then take all the Jesus stuff literally. If you take the Caesar stuff metaphorically, Jesus stuff metaphorically. But either way, there's a clash. There's a clash. It's like two claimants for a presidential election. There's two. And if there's two, there's a problem. Now I leave that hanging for people to think about. No, seriously, very seriously.
Yep.
So what you cannot do, this is me speaking now as a responsible historian and a responsible Christian. You cannot say, well, it's all metaphorical, you know, about Caesar. Nobody really believed that. But it's really literal about Jesus. No. The challenge is faith. I don't believe it as a way of seeing Caesar. I commit my life to it as a way of seeing Jesus. It's not what I don't believe one, I believe the other. If you believed Caesar, and I have no problem using the word believe, if you took it for granted, then you live accordingly. So metaphor creates reality. That's the truth about metaphor. It's, if somebody says to me, is it real? I say, of course it's real. Is it literal? Of course it's not literal. The opposite to metaphorical is literal. Opposite to real is unreal. So metaphor creates reality. That's something surely we, to give an example from the 30s, the Third Reich in Germany and the rest of the world created a reality. It lasted 12 years, not 1,000 years. But for a while, it was reality for people. And for some people, it still is, by the way. Just hasn't been. We have an alternative in the 30s too, in this country, Roosevelt, the New Deal. People started living the Third Reich. People started living the New Deal. Both were metaphors, ways of seeing the future. People lived them. What we learned, I hope, is that metaphors can be absolutely lethal. It doesn't, you can't say, well, it's all perception. The perception worked for the 1930s, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41 maybe. You know, by 45, that metaphor had been shown to be absolutely lethally disastrous. But if neither of those metaphors had happened, a third one would be operational somewhere. We don't get out of metaphor. But if you commit yourself to a metaphor, if you live by a metaphor, this is what Paul is saying. If you don't live by a metaphor, then stop talking about it. If you want to talk about democracy, is a metaphor. It's a way of living. It doesn't descend from heaven and just happen, you know, like springtime, and you just kind of go along with it. Or winter, you just go along with it. It's going to come whether you like it or not. Nah. Metaphor becomes reality when lived. Therefore, for example, if you could imagine us, let me imagine Easter Sunday morning exactly as it's written in the Bible. Empty tomb and visions. I don't think the finding of the empty tomb is historical. I do think there were visions. Okay, but let me take it all literally, all right? Now, what you would have expected in the first century was ascension. We've got an empty tomb. In the Greco-Roman world of the first century and in the Jewish world, what does an empty tomb mean if there was no grave robbery? Let's imagine that. That it's either grave robbery, so the body was stolen, or ascended into heaven. Those are your options. If you want to say the year 30, that's what I expect. If people find an empty tomb and they have visions of Jesus, I'm not saying risen visions, notice. I'm saying vindicated, triumphant visions, some neutral term. Then the enemies will say, hey, you guys stole the body. Sure, it's in Matthew. That's typically what you'd expect. And they're going to say, he's ascended to God. Like happened to Moses in their tradition of Philo and Josephus. And for the Romans, the Greeks, what happened to Romulus. And in fact, what happened to Caesar Augustus. At least in the year 14, he ascended to God. You might want to argue whether Jesus got there first, but those are issues.
Mm.
Ascension is what I would expect. Now, this is a huge question of this book. Where did resurrection come from? That's a Pharisaic idea. I thought they were the bad guys. So is there any evidence, historical evidence, that followers of Jesus had resurrection before Paul? The only other document we have around the time of Paul, which is called the Gospel according to Q, the source used by Matthew and Luke besides Mark, not a word about Jesus' resurrection or his execution for that matter. It's all about his words as wisdom incarnate.
Yeah.
And of course, what happens to wisdom incarnate is it gets rejected.
Yeah.
And that's expected, but there's nothing about crucifixion, execution, resurrection. Wisdom has ascended and incarnate in Jesus, and rejected goes back to God. It's not even mentioned ascension. It just isn't there. So these are the earliest. They're from the 50s, Paul and Q. So these are long before Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, at least 20 years earlier. So I find this execution, resurrection powerfully the center of Paul. And trying to live that out is what's going on.
So if Paul brought in this idea of resurrection, right? Paul the Pharisee, his Pharisaic idea, brings this into the picture and the story of Jesus and what eventually becomes Christianity. One of the biggest critiques that I hear about Paul is that for a lot of people, Christianity is more like Paulianity, and that, it's everything that Paul taught, and that's somewhat divorced in some ways, even from what Jesus might have taught or stood for. So I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to that a little bit. Like, in your estimation, are there differences between Jesus and Paul? Like, is Paul in any places, does he stand for something that might even be opposite or different than what Jesus stood for? Or is Paul more like an extension of Jesus? Did he kind of take Jesus and maybe take it to the next level to make it more applicable for his time, his world, and then carry it into the future of the church and what it's become today? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
So let me start with the positive, and then I will go to the negative.
Okay.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
The positive is this. Jesus spent his time speaking, I would say, to a peasant audience. That would include, of course, could well include a slave who might be the steward of a big absentee landlord. So on one level, he would be lower than a peasant because he's a slave, but he might be higher than a peasant because he might be their boss in the land. So you have to presume that in Jesus' audience, there would be people who could read and write.
Yeah.
There could be slaves, of course. But that would mean there were slaves on a big estate. So he's talking to very ordinary people in the small towns of Galilee. And in Q, you can still see they seem to be in that atmosphere. They're talking about Bethsaida. They're talking about Capernaum. They're talking of Nazareth. They haven't broken out into the great big world. Now, Jesus was executed in Jerusalem. And as best we can think, during Passover. I think he had brought his movement. He was challenged to bring his movement to Jerusalem, where he had supporters, because this would break it out into the great big world. Passover means Jews from all over the world here. So if you're serious, I think somebody must have said, maybe the relatives at Bethany said to him, "Hey, Jesus, if you're serious about this, get out of Galilee." They might have been nasty, said those hick towns or something like that.
Right.
Take it to where the action is. Take it to the capital and take it at Passover. We can protect you.
Yeah.
Anyway, Jesus would have bought it there. Now, Paul is speaking in the great capital cities. I think Paul is a capitalist. His whole theory is there's thousands of Roman cities. I'll never get through them all, even in Turkey, our Turkey.
Yeah.
In Asia Minor, they're everywhere. I'm going for the capitals. Think of all the places we know about. Philippi is kind of the the exception. Thessaloniki, Athens, Ephesus, Antioch, everywhere he uses capitals.
Mm.
When he says he's going to Rome, I think it's probably Tarragona. That's where he's going there, the capital of the Roman province.
Mhm.
So his strategy, I think, is to hit the capitals.
Mm.
Now, he has to speak the language. I don't mean Greek. I mean, he has to speak the cultural language.
Mhm.
And Rome, excuse me, Israel is an occupied country. The Greeks of Asia Minor, for example, or of Greece, don't think of themselves in general as being not part of an occupied country. They're doing real well. I mean, if you're anyway, even an artisan or in those countries, figure, well, the Pax Romanus seems to be good for business. You know, whatever's happening on the periphery, we won't worry about, but, you know, it's pretty peaceful here, so maybe it's all right. Maybe it's okay. They'll have their own problems, but that's a separate issue. So I think Paul is taking it out into the great big world.
Mm.
And he's taking on the world. Jesus can talk to his fellow Jews about the kingdom of God that we've all expected, the prophets talk about, is now here, as I understand Jesus saying, insofar as we participate in it. If we don't, it ain't. Now, that's talking to people who all know all about. If he says the kingdom of God, everyone knows what he's talking about. That's God's rule on earth. We've been talking about it in days to come. The prophet said it's coming. Yep, yeah, we know about it. Now, go out of the great big Roman world. The Lord is Caesar.
Mm.
The Lord is Caesar. So a title, for example, that might be just used of Jesus out of the Old Testament, Lord, Paul will use it as the Lord.
Mm.
Rome has no problem with everyone having their little lords, you know, or their little gods.
Right.
But just don't say that your Lord is the Lord.
Yeah.
When Paul cruises backwards and forwards between my Lord, our Lord, the Lord, that step is called treason.
Mm.
Because if Rome hears, what do you mean by saying the Lord? Are you saying our guy ain't? And if Paul is challenged, of course, that's what he's going to have to say. Yes.
Mm.
So Paul is taking the message of Jesus to a great, big, I'm going to say worldwide, because that's the way Rome sees itself.
Mm.
There's the Irish over there in their bogs and the Saxons in their forests, and they're uncivilizable.
Mm.
Why? Because we haven't civilized them.
Yeah.
If we civilize you, you're civilizable, like the Greeks. So they have their world, and there's one Lord and all the rest of it. And so they're ready in a way to hear a language of, no, this Lord is not the Lord. There is an alternative. And an educated Roman hearing Paul, let's say he's open-minded, would probably say, no, wait a minute. Caesar Augustus is the savior of the world. He's brought peace to the Roman world from, 20 years of savage civil war with legions on both sides.
Mm.
He's brought peace to the world. We think he's divine because that's what gods are for, peace. So you're saying this guy, Jesus, what's his name? The Christ? He's the savior of the world? Come on, Paul. There's only one world. Why do we need two saviors?
Mm.
Now, that's what Paul wants to hear.
Yeah.
That was in pitching.
Mm.
He's in pitching.
Mm.
Well, he might say, I don't know. We're not at peace. We're at lull.
Mm.
There's been, he might say, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, now the Romans. It's just more imperial power. They all come and go, and in between, or at the end, there's always war.
Mm.
You talk about the Roman peace, Paul would say. This is the Roman lull. We're living in it, so it's very nice, but don't call it peace.
Mm.
So Paul has to operate in that world. He can't not. Now, Jesus, in one sense, is in that world, of course. That's why he's going to get killed by it.
Sure.
But he can talk to his own people, a language they all know. Paul knows that language too. But that's not the language is going to make sense in that big world. So continuity, yes, absolute continuity, absolute fidelity. Now, there's one thing I do see. Jesus has this absolutely startling statement, love your enemies. Well, why? Because that's the way God operates, he says, Matthew. God sends the rain on the good and the bad, brings up the sun for the just and the unjust. That is flatly contradictory to Deuteronomy 28, which says, you obey the Lord your God, everything goes well, including the weather. Disobey the Lord your God, everything goes bad.
Yeah.
Now, along comes Jesus, says that's not how God operates. Paul in Romans, chapter 12, as it goes towards 13 in our counting, comes very close, very, very close to saying love your enemies. He doesn't say it now. Pray for them, maybe, all of that, but love is your enemies. Why? Not because that's the way God is, but because vengeance is mine, says the Lord. In other words, don't bother using violence against your enemies because God will get them better. Now, I don't know if that's sort of an offhand thing from Paul, or if you really poked him about it and knew enough to say what Jesus says. This he's quoting from the Old Testament. Would he back off it? Would he say, well, I leave that up to God, or who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
But certainly the most radical thing that Jesus ever says, and it's enough if that's all he said, is love your enemy, because that'll make you, now his term is sons of God. Let's cross out sons and put in heirs, H-E-I-R-S, because that's what sons meant in the first century. They had primogeniture, son gets the stuff. So heirs. If you want to be like God, heirs of God, in God's family, then you love your enemies, because God operates like that.
Yeah.
That is radically new. Really, really, really radically new. And I consider it, by the way, to be the motto of nonviolent resistance. Why didn't Jesus say love everyone? Why pick on enemies? Does that mean you don't love your friends? Why does Jesus presume you have enemies? Because what you're doing is taking on the normalcy of civilization. Do you really think it'll go quietly into that good night? It's not foretelling his own execution or Paul's execution or anything else, but it does say, know what you're doing. You're not just asking the Romans to be kinder and gentler. You're imagining a different world. Paul's term is a new creation. That's also a Roman world, by the way. There's an inscription from Priene from 9 BCE, which celebrates Caesar Augustus as the founder of a new world, a world without war. By the way, he's brought peace, as I said. So the claims made of Jesus are counterclaims to the claims made of Caesar. They're not just using the language because it's there. They're counterclaims. So that's the challenge of the first century. Now, the challenge of the 21st century is Caesarism. Is alive and well. Caesarism, it's actually used. Caesarism means the despot, autocrat. His Greek term for imperator is autocrator, autocrat, self-powered. That's what an imperator meant, not just emperor. So anywhere in the world today, you find the appeal to autocracy. What we need is one person. It made sense in the first century. Caesar had worked. He had brought peace. He really had. I mean, they had from 49 in a way, all the way to 31, to give it 20 years in round numbers. 23rd of September, 31, the Battle of Actium. Peace. Now, a cynic, before we give the Nobel Peace Prize to Augustus Caesar for establishing peace, we might note of course, that it was peace from a war that they had started, which has never stopped people getting the Nobel Peace Prize, as you know. You run the war for 20 years, basically, going back to his adopted father, great uncle, Julius Caesar. 20 years of civil war, you bring peace. Roman civil war, of course. He must be divine. He's brought peace. He's revealed the peaceful nature of the gods, as it were. So this is a huge theology. And I'm going to be real blunt here. I'm sorry. If somebody hasn't read the Virgil's Aeneid before they get into Paul, first of all, they shouldn't do it because they won't know what he's talking about. He's talking against Pauline Christic, no, Pauline Messianic Christic theology is a counterpoint to Roman imperial theology. It's a clash of theology. And you're only hearing one side of it. It would be like if we took a presidential debate and just heard one person, but never heard the other person. You wouldn't know what's going on. Even if you agreed with the person, you still wouldn't know what's going on. So there's a therapy or a prophylaxis necessary before we read Paul. There really is. Just read Virgil's Aeneid. In English, it'll do fine in any good translation, because this is the New Testament of Roman imperial theology. And if you have the time, read the Iliad, which is their Old Testament.
Yeah. So it's almost like if you just read the letters of Paul without that background, you would come away thinking Paul's just really excited about this guy Jesus. When in reality, yeah, but he's also you miss the fact that he's speaking, for lack of a better word, like speaking against something else, or he's trying to layer Jesus, who he's very excited about, on top of all of this background of Roman theology with Caesar and being a son of God and all these different things. Like if you miss that aspect, then you miss out on a very big piece of what Paul is trying to say about Jesus.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. I mean, it's difficult with letters. I leave that, but let's imagine that that's not the problem. The problem for us is we have not that background.
Yeah.
It's not part of our education. You know, in my own case, by pure luck or providence or anything you want to call it, I went to a classical boarding school, so I had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin. It was simply left over by the receding tide of British imperialism. They were gone by 21, 22, and I was born in 34. So when I went to boarding school in 1945 to 1950, 5 years, I had the education system left by the British. Okay? I was taught in a boarding school run by priests. It was a magnificent education, by the way, but it was simply the look of the game. They hadn't changed it from what the British education system at Eton or places like that was, to teach their young people how to run an empire. So we study the Greeks and the Romans, and we won't mention the fact that they both lost their empires, but we could, you know, we won't mention that the Greeks invented democracy and lost it with an empire, and the Romans invented a republic and lost it with an empire. But we teach our kids about Greek and Latin, and they won't notice that maybe. So I got that education, which meant that I read Virgil when I was about 13 in Latin. Now, please don't think I'm not hinting, oh, I understood the whole thing. At 13, all I wanted to do was get the conjugations right, get the clenches right, amo, amasa, mat, don't, you know, not blow it and get hit by my teacher. But it was all there. So when I came to read the New Testament, I never went through the fundamentalism that happened in this country. I just didn't. Not because I was so intelligent. No, I had just this other stuff, and I'd read those stories. So I recognized counter stories. I see what they're doing. Now, did I believe them? Well, yeah, I accepted this counter story against that one in the same way that when I sang a rebel song, about the Irish against the British, did I believe that the Irish were all good and the British were all bad? But I got the point.
Right.
Which side are you on was the point.
Yeah.
And the answer was, I'm on the Irish side,
Mm.
of course. So I was used to all of that type of stuff, counterpoint and everything else.
Yeah.
That was just the look of growing up in Ireland. Nothing to do with me being so intelligent. I saw all of this before other people. I had to learn about fundamentalism when I came to this country.
Yeah.
In 1951, I was 17. I don't think I even understood it really until well into the Jesus seminar, that people were taking this stuff literally.
Mm.
I thought they were just taking it seriously, which was fine. So was I. And that they knew all this other stuff. And maybe they did, of course. I'm not saying they didn't.
Mm.
But something had happened with me because the other got in there first.
Yeah.
And in due time,
Mm.
it came up differently. But by the way, my problem was papal fundamentalism. If I ran into trouble, it wasn't with the Bible, it was with the Pope.
Right.
The authority of the Pope was papal fundamentalism. We had our own fundamentalism.
Yeah. Yeah. What I love about this is, and just love about your work and how it's influenced my own journey, is like I'm realizing after making my way through most of this book and now talking to you that there's real parallels to how we can understand Paul as someone who grew up fundamentalist evangelical, how I've now how I came to understand Paul then and how I came to understand Jesus, and how there's parallels between how my thoughts about Jesus have evolved and how my thoughts about Paul can also continue to evolve. Because one of the books that you wrote that made the biggest impact on me was, I think you wrote it with Marcus Borg, the Christmas book, The First Christmas. And that was one of my first books I read of yours. And I remember I read it. I was just coming out of like my evangelical world and I read it. And I had like a lot of questions I was wrestling with. And I read this book and I put it away for like a year because it was too much for me to handle. Because I was like, oh my goodness, like the birth story of Jesus in my mind, like it had to happen exactly this way. And like you bring up in the book, you and Marcus, about all these different parallels between the birth story and the world in which this story took place, and all the talk about, Caesar and Jesus being the son of God, and like what all that language meant, and what these writers were trying to speak to, in their culture and in their time, and how, the story likely didn't happen exactly the way these writers said it did, but again, they were writing in order to make these specific points. Now, pull all that into this conversation about Paul, I'm realizing that the same thing is kind of true, in that Paul, again, was writing in this specific culture to make these specific points. And that rather than take every single detail of his words absolutely literal, we have to realize that he was speaking to a very literal thing that was happening in his world, but he was trying to draw these different parallels. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if I read Paul's words in that way, just as I've come to read the stories of Jesus in that way, it brings a whole new light, I think, to the world of Paul and to the things that Paul was trying to get across to his readers and then ultimately to us today. Did anything I say just make any sense at all?
If it doesn't, then I have failed. Let me put it this way. I am really, really profoundly not interested in attacking fundamentalism. So all I've got to say is this. I'm much more interested in the positive vision.
Yeah,
I really am.
yeah.
I mean, I suppose I can be snarky like anyone else, but in general, that's not what I want to say. Is if you're reading, say, Matthew 1 and 2 or Luke 1 and 2, you mentioned, the question I ask is, what is this author trying to do?
Mhm.
That's where I start. And I don't really start by, I really don't, but is this true or is this not true? Like this, don't like that. I really don't.
Mhm.
That tells me nothing in a way. I ask, what's he trying to do? Why is Matthew so different from Luke? What are they each trying to do? Total
Mhm.
focus. I don't go into Matthew and say, why doesn't he have the shepherds? Where are the shepherds? I don't go into Luke and say, hey, he forgot the Magi. No, and it really is extremely helpful, and that's my term, to have Matthew and Luke.
Mm-hmm.
I only had Matthew or only had Luke. You could be skeptical, but skepticism isn't really good exegesis. If you have the two of them and you watch what one has in terms of its own gospel and what the other has in terms of its own gospel, you can see how each are writing an overture, and they make eminent sense in terms of their own gospel.
Yeah.
So here's my rock bottom. Theology interprets history. I would even say theology is a transcendental interpretation of history. It's not just a surface. It tries to go as deep as you can. But that means that history comes first. Otherwise, you got nothing to interpret.
Yeah.
So you can't say, well, let's begin with theology. If you begin with theology, you won't know what you're doing. You really won't. It would be like somebody, from a different world trying to understand the term woke. And they say, I don't know. I don't understand it. They seem to be against woke. So maybe they don't like getting up in the morning. I don't know what's going on.
Right.
Every one of us knows immediately what's going on.
Yeah.
Because we're in the modern matrix of living it.
Yeah.
But if another world, even another country, possibly might say, I don't understand. Why are some people for woke and against woke? Is that a drink? Maybe that's a beer or something. you wouldn't have a clue what's going on.
Yeah.
So what I would put it this way. I distinguish between literalism and fundamentalism. A literalist is somebody who takes literally what I would take metaphorically. A fundamentalist is somebody, as a literalist, who says, and if you don't take it that way, you ain't a Christian. I would never say that to a literalist.
Yeah.
Somebody tells me that Matthew and Luke happened exactly the way it's told in Matthew 1 and 2 and 1 and 2. I would say, okay, now, let's say it happened. Why do you think it might be important that there were shepherds there and there were wise men from the east there? Why didn't Herod send representatives? In other words, okay, fine, let's take it literally, but probe the stories.
Yeah.
Even if you want to put them together, but that's probably not the right way to do it. So take it literally if you want to. But this argument about literal against metaphorical, which is going nowhere, nobody's going to change their mind much. At least acknowledge that within Christianity, there are Christians who take it literally. And whether you like it or not, there are Christians who take it metaphorically. And by metaphorically, I mean they are trying to live it. And I would warn you that Jesus says, watch out for those who say, Lord, Lord, and don't live it. That's a warning from Jesus, not from me. Because if this stuff is serious, either you flip the whole thing and say it's all ancient rubbish or ancient delusions. If you take it literally, you got to live it. If you take it metaphorically, you still got to live it.
Yeah.
Unless you simply say, as I said, it's just ancient delusions from the 1st century and put it quietly to burial, put R.I.P. on it, Jesus R.I.P. May he rest in peace.
Yeah, I love that idea, what you just said about how if you start with theology as opposed to history, like you're in danger of vastly missing point. And I think, like, looking back on my own education, and there's a lot of great things I would say about my education and my past, a lot of things that, as much as I might disagree with today, that I take forward with me and has helped form me, all those things. But I think looking back on even like in seminary, my theology classes and stuff, we all started with theology, like Wayne Grudem's systematic theology. I went through and there were all these different topics and you learned how to build your argument from all of these verses without really ever talking about, what the books these verses were coming from, the person who wrote it, the audience they were writing to. Like, we just took the line out of the journal, like you said earlier. Like, we just took these one lines out to build these arguments without really any consideration about what these one lines meant in the greater context of what this individual is writing about. And now I'm in this place where, thanks to your work Bart Ehrman's work, lots of people's work have helped me really appreciate a lot more of the background that we can maybe glean from history of what was going on in these cultures, what these people were dealing with in their lives. The author, what they were trying to maybe speak to these people, and all of that can really help inform those one lines that we used to take out in our systematic theology
Yeah.
textbooks, and how and maybe bring a whole new meaning to it, which I think is so interesting. So what I've been able to do with Jesus, and you've talked a lot about the historical Jesus, things like that, I'm now beginning to see that I can bring that into my thoughts about Paul, which makes Paul a lot less scary than, like I said earlier in the opening of our conversation, um, and help me like disarm him a little bit so I can engage him in a little bit of a different way now that I'm evolved in my own faith.
Yeah, would postscript to that, if you get bad history, you're going to get bad theology.
Yeah, right.
If you get good history, you might get good theology at least.
Hmm.
Um, let me say one slogan I've been using,
Hmm.
talking about Paul is scary. I've been using "Who's afraid of the big bad Paul?" But my answer is most of the New Testament.
Mm,
So it doesn't start with us, because Paul takes, as I said, the radicality of Jesus,
yeah.
doesn't invent it, out into the great big world. Instead of kind of keeping it over there in the Jewish Levant, as it were, where the Romans could say, well, all sorts of weird ideas come from there. Um, it's out into the great big world.
Mm,
So Luke Luke Acts is a program really to de-radicalize Paul and re-Romanize Paul.
mm,
And Colossians and Ephesians, and let me put it, the epistles that are attributed to Paul, but by consensus of scholarship probably don't come from him, are not just neutral prolongations of Pauline theology. They're counterpoints
mm,
on certain issues, at least. Not
mhm,
on everything. No, not on everything, but on certain issues. So if Paul would say there's neither, let me do this one. If Paul would say in Galatians, there's neither slave nor free, Colossians and Ephesians says, of course there's slaves and free, but Christian masters and mistresses are kind to their slaves,
mm,
and Christian slaves obey their masters or mistresses. Well, you see, to say there's neither slave nor free, even if you're not saying it violently or anything else, that says that the Roman Empire, which is a slave economy, is wrong.
mm,
As much as if somebody were to say that and take it literally and seriously, take that one literally, in, say, the antebellum American South, then you're saying that our civilization, our plantation civilization, is what? What are you saying? You're saying it's wrong. You say it's doomed. You're saying it's against the will of God. What are you saying? So that's explosive, because if I'm fighting against Paul, say, as an aristocratic Roman, I can accuse him on that term alone of saying that our slaves should rise up and kill us all in our beds.
mm,
It's not saying that. Of course he's not. But I can get him on that. I can go to the authorities and say, here's what he's saying. There, in Christ Jesus, there's neither slave nor free. And he thinks we should all be Christian. That means our whole economy
mm.
is evil. Then I go on with my accusations, as you would, if you're against somebody. He thinks we should all be murdered.
Mm.
He's calling on slaves to rise up, execute him.
So what would you say, last question for you, what, in light of all the stuff we just talked about, in light of your book, speaking to our listeners, many of which came from a similar background as me, what do you want us to take away from this book, from this conversation, as we go forth and we continue to think about Paul, continue to evolve in our faith? How can your book, how can this conversation be a tool for us as we continue to grow and evolve in our thoughts?
Well, excuse me, the big scenario is, look, we're talking about the gospel.
Mhm.
Okay. We have, as you know, in the New Testament, the gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and according to Paul, if you want to do it.
Right.
Yeah, Paul would say, yeah, that's according to.
Mhm.
So openly and honestly, these people say, we have a gospel. Now, a gospel is good news. That's what it means.
Mhm.
Clearly, that's an interpretation, right?
Yep.
We have a presidential debate, let's say. I won't use any names. And you say X1, good news. Obviously, you're interpreting good news for the X supporters
Yep.
or Y supporters, whatever. So good news is interpretation.
Mhm.
It's an interpretation of history.
Yep.
History might say Jesus was executed. You're saying that's good news. Now, how is that good news? Paul's going to say it's good news. How is that good news? Your guy was executed?
Mhm.
Well, we have the answer, we said, because what it reveals, Paul would say. Then we have, according to Matthew, Mark, they give us 4 different interpretations of an interpretation.
Mhm.
I can't imagine anything more honest. The Roman Empire never, well, it does say the good news, the gospel, Evangelia, plural actually, of Caesar, but it would never say according to Tacitus, according to Josephus, according to, no, they all got it right.
Mhm.
They wouldn't give us 4 different accounts. There might be survivals. I think it's ferociously honest. It's like it shouts at me, it's about the interpretation, dummy.
Mhm.
But of course, interpretation again and again and again is about how you live it.
Mhm.
It's never simply up about you. You can't say good news unless you accept it.
Mhm.
You really can't. Otherwise, be honest and say it's bad news or it's dumb news or it's delusional.
Mhm.
So I'd ask people to even look at their New Testament. You got 4 versions for different groups, how to live it in different situations. You can't get away from interpretation. I'm going to come back. Theology interprets history,
Mhm.
and whether you like it or not, both belong to God.
Mhm.
If you don't like history, take it up with God. It wasn't my idea.
Yep.
But what I'm doing is I'm going to try and understand history. Then I'm going to try and interpret history as to understand the people in the first century. Third point, I'm going to say, and how does that impact us today?
Mhm.
And the reason I'm going to ask that question is because the people who wrote in the first century said we're writing for the ages.
Mhm.
If Paul said, I'm writing this to the Corinthians and it just applies to the Corinthians and nobody else, then fine. Maybe he's relevant, maybe he's not.
Yep.
But Jesus claims he's speaking about God's rule on earth. I don't think he thinks that's just for the first 30 years of the first century. So if I'm going to treat Jesus seriously, even if I thought he was totally wrong, I'd have to say, well, he's speaking not just to the Galilean peasantry, but he's telling the Galilean peasantry about how he thinks the world should be.
Mhm.
Okay, then that's a claim I have to face. I may well say he's perfectly right for the Galilean peasantry, but totally outdated for us.
Mhm.
I could say that to be an honest conclusion. Same of Paul. But the thesis of this book is Paul is absolutely relevant. That means his Jesus, of course, is absolutely relevant for our century.
Mhm.
That's the claim. Now, anyone reading the book has every right and even duty to say, I think it's right.
Mhm.
But if they simply say, I think it's interesting, come on. You're just making a claim.
Yeah.
And, it's like listening to presidential advertisements. They're making a claim.
Yeah.
You say, I believe it. Then you're committing yourself to a certain vision of life.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. Don, we are out of time, my friend. but this has been wonderful. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. As I've said, it's made such a big influence on me. I'm forever grateful, but thank you for joining us.
Very much my pleasure. Anytime, Glenn.
Thank you. And real quick, is there any place you want to direct people to online where they can maybe interact more with this particular work or anything else you have out there?
No, what's driving me crazy is for some reason on August the 1st, around August the 1st, my Facebook, which is 20 years old, almost from the very beginning, everything I've ever done is there, but nothing new can go in. And they didn't censor me or anything else. I have no idea. I've done everything possible.
Hmm.
Tried to send in my driver's license to them and who I am, and I can't I can change the past, but it's kind of ironic of all I'm talking about. I cannot touch the future.
It's like an illustration.
Perfect illustration. I can go
Modern
back in there
illustration.
and change something I wrote in the past,
Yeah.
and even change my profile. And it's not me, it's not the password. I've tried everything, really.
Huh.
Um, I've obviously said to them, but they don't help. I don't think
Yeah.
they read their mail. So all I'm trying to do is, if you put it up onto Facebook, do you?
Yep.
I will try and um, I've shifted from Facebook. I'm sorry, I meant to say YouTube. Will you put it up on YouTube? Do you?
It'll go up on YouTube. It'll go up on Facebook, all over the place. Yeah.
I try and do everything I can to promote it. At least I've gone to YouTube Premium to try and see what I can do.
That's fine. Yeah, and I'll put your links, to your website and your other work in the show notes so we can direct people there.
Okay.
And then we'll do this again for a fifth time soon.
Thank you
Excellent.
very much.
Thanks, Tom.